So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event. And she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage. And I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing.
It's a simple idea about nature, and I want to say a word for nature, because we haven't talked that much about it the last couple days. I want to say a word for the soil and the bees, the plants and the animals. And tell you about a tool, a very simple tool that I have found, although it's really nothing more than a literary conceit, it's not a technology, is very powerful for, I think, changing our relationship to the natural world and to the other species on whom we depend. And that tool is very simply, as Chris suggested, looking at us and the world from the plants or the animals' point of view. It's not my idea, other people have hit on it, but I've tried to take it to some new places. Let me tell you where I got it. Like a lot of my ideas, like a lot of the tools I use, I found it in the garden. I'm a very devoted gardener. And there was a day about 7 years ago, I was planting potatoes. It was the first week of May. This is New England, when the apple trees are just vibrating with bloom. They're just white clouds above. I was here planting my chunks, cutting up potatoes and planting it, and the bees were working on this tree. Bumblebees just making this thing vibrate. And one of the things I really...
It's wonderful to be back. I love this wonderful gathering, and you must be wondering, what on earth? Have they put up the wrong slide? No. Look at this magnificent beast and ask the question, who designed it? This is TED, this is Technology Entertainment Design, and there's a dairy cow. It's a quite wonderfully designed animal. And I was thinking, how do I introduce this? And I thought, well, maybe that old doggerel by Joyce Kilmer, poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And you might say, well, God designed the cow. But of course, God got a lot of help. This is the ancestor of cattle. This is the oryx. And it was designed by natural selection, the process of natural selection over many millions of years. And then it became domesticated thousands of years ago, and human beings became its stewards, and without even knowing what they were doing, they gradually redesigned it and redesigned it and redesigned it, and then more recently...
A few years ago, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. So I decided to follow in the footsteps of the great American philosopher, Morgan Spurlock, and try something new for 30 days. The idea is actually pretty simple. Think about something you've always wanted to add to your life and try it for the next 30 days. It turns out 30 days is just about the right amount of time to add a new habit or subtract a habit, like watching the news, from your life. There's a few things that I learned while doing these 30-day challenges. The first was, instead of the months flying by forgotten, the time was much more memorable. This was part of a challenge I did to take a picture every day for a month. And I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing that day. I also noticed that as I started to do more and harder 30-day challenges, my self-confidence grew. I went from desk-dwelling computer nerd to the kind of guy who bikes to work for fun. Even last year, I ended up hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. I would never have been that adventurous before I started my 30-day challenges. I also...
My favorite topic is shortcuts. The master of shortcuts is, of course, nature. But I will demonstrate different ways to get rid of difficulties and go to the point, to find an answer, probably much quicker than Arthur did. So, first we violate the common sense, the logic. All of you, if you hold your hand like this, 90 degrees. All of you, not you. All of you, right? Palm up. If you do this, the logic say you must turn the wrist. You agree? Good. But I will first teach you a method how you can do it without moving the wrist, and then the shortcut. You can do it immediately, right? Hold the hand like this, palm up. Don't move the wrist. The wrist is, I doesn't speak very many, but I do the best what I are. Right? Molded, you say, with iron? That was a joke, actually. And
I'm going to talk today about energy and climate. And that might seem a bit surprising because my full-time work at the Foundation is mostly about vaccines and seeds, about the things that we need to invent and deliver to help the poorest 2 billion live better lives. But energy and climate are extremely important to these people. In fact, more important than to anyone else on the planet. The climate getting worse means that many years their crops won't grow. There'll be too much rain, not enough rain. Things will change in ways that their fragile environment simply can't support. And that leads to starvation, it leads to uncertainty, it leads to unrest. So the climate changes will be terrible for them. Also, the price of energy is very important to them. In fact, if you could pick just one thing to lower the price of to reduce poverty, by far you would pick energy. Now, the price of energy has come down over time. Advanced civilization is based on advances in energy. The coal revolution fueled the industrial...
As a boy, I loved cars. When I turned 18, I lost my best friend to a car accident, like this. And then I decided I dedicate my life to saving 1 million people every year. Now, I haven't succeeded, so this is just a progress report, but I'm here to tell you a little bit about self-driving cars. I saw the concept first in the DARPA Grand Challenges, where the US government issued a prize to build self-driving cars that could navigate a desert. And even though 100 teams were there, these cars went nowhere. So we decided at Stanford to build a different self-driving car. We built the hardware, the software, we made it learn from us, and we set it free in the desert. And the unimaginable happened. It became the first car to ever return from a DARPA Grand Challenge, winning Stanford $2 million, yet I still hadn't saved a single life. Since our work has focused on building driving cars that can drive anywhere by themselves, any street in California. We've driven 140.
I wanted to give you 4 specific examples that I'm going to cover at the end about how a product called Silk tripled their sales by doing one thing, how an artist named Jeff Koons went from being a nobody to making a whole bunch of money and having a lot of impact, to how Frank Gehry redefined what it meant to be an architect, and one of my biggest failures as a marketer in the last few years, a record label I started that had a CD called Sauce. But before I can do that, I got to tell you about sliced bread and a guy named Otto Rohwedder. Now, before sliced bread was invented in the 1910s, I wonder what they said, like the greatest invention since the telegraph or something. But this guy named Otto Rohwedder invented sliced bread. And he focused, like most inventors did, on the patent part and the making part. And the thing about the invention of sliced bread is this, that for the first 15 years after sliced bread was available, no one bought it, No one knew about it. It was a complete and total failure. And the reason is that until Wonder came along and figured out how to spread the idea of sliced bread, no one wanted it. That the success of sliced bread, like the success of almost everything we've been talking about at this conference, is not always about what the patent is like or what the factory.
When I was a child, I always wanted to be a superhero. I wanted to save the world and then make everyone happy. But I knew that I'd need superpowers to make my dreams come true. So I used to embark on these imaginary journeys to find intergalactic objects from planet Krypton, which was a lot of fun but didn't yield much result. When I grew up and realized that science fiction was not a good source for superpowers, I decided instead to embark on a journey of real science to find a more useful truth. I started my journey in California with a UC Berkeley 30-year longitudinal study that examined the photos of students in an old yearbook and tried to measure their success and well-being throughout their life. By measuring the students' smiles, researchers were able to predict how fulfilling and long-lasting a subject marriage will be, how well she would score in standardized tests of well-being, and how inspiring she would be to others. In another yearbook, I stumbled upon Barack Obama's picture. When I first saw his picture, I thought that his superpowers came from his super collar. But now I know it was all in his smile. Another aha moment came from a 2010.
I was speaking to a group of about 300 kids, ages 6 to 8, at a children's museum. And I brought with me a bag full of legs, similar to the kinds of things you see up here, and had them laid out on a table for the kids. And from my experience, kids are naturally curious about what they don't know or don't understand or is foreign to them. They only learn to be frightened of those differences when an adult influences them to behave that way and maybe censors that natural curiosity or reins in the question asking in the hopes of them being polite little kids. So, I just pictured a first grade teacher out in the lobby with these unruly kids saying, "Now, whatever you do, don't stare at her legs." When, of course, that's the point. That's why I was there. I wanted to invite them to look and explore. So I made a deal with the adults that the kids could come in without any adults for 2 minutes on their own. So the doors open, the kids descend on this table of legs, and they are poking and prodding, and they're wiggling toes, and they're trying to put their full weight on the sprinting leg to see what happens with that. And I said, "Kids, really quickly, I woke up this morning, I decided I wanted to be able to jump over a house. Nothing too big, 2 or 3 stories, but if you could think of any animal, any superhero..."
We're 26 years after the advent of the Macintosh, which was an astoundingly seminal event in the history of human-machine interface and in computation in general. It fundamentally changed the way that people thought about computation, thought about computers, how they used them, and who and how many people were able to use them. It was such a radical change, in fact, that the early Macintosh development team in 82, 83, 84 had to write an entirely new operating system from the ground up. Now, this is an interesting little message, and it's a lesson that has since, I think, been forgotten or lost or something, and that is, namely, that the OS is the interface. The interface is the OS. It's like the Land and the King and Arthur. They're inseparable. They are one. And to write a new operating system was not a capricious matter. It wasn't just a matter of tuning up some graphics routines. There were no graphics routines. There were no mouse drivers. So it was a necessity. But in the quarter century since then, we've seen all of the fundamental supporting technologies go berserk. So memory capacity and disk capacity has been multiplied by something between 10,000 and 1 million. Same thing for processor speeds. Networks, we didn't have networks at all at the time of the Macintosh's introduction. And that has become the single most salient aspect of how...
You'll be happy to know that I'll be talking not about my own tragedy, but other people's tragedy. It's a lot easier to be lighthearted about other people's tragedy than your own, and I want to keep in the spirit of the conference. So if you believe the media accounts, being a drug dealer in the height of the crack cocaine epidemic was a very glamorous life, in the words of Virginia Pastrell. There was money, there was drugs, guns, women, you name it, jewelry, bling bling, it had it all. Okay? What I'm here to tell you today is that, in fact, based on 10 years of research, a unique opportunity to go inside a gang, to see the actual books, the financial records of the gang, that the answer turns out not to be that being in the gang was a glamorous life, but I think more realistically, that being in a gang, selling drugs for a gang, is perhaps the worst job in all of America. And that's what I'd like to convince you of today. Okay, so there are three things I want to do. First, I want to explain how and why crack cocaine had such a profound influence on inner city gangs. Secondly, I want to tell you how somebody like me came to be able to see the inner workings of a gang.
The Dirty Jobs crew and I were called to a little town in Colorado called Craig. It's only a couple dozen square miles. It's in the Rockies, and the job in question was sheep rancher. My role on the show, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's pretty simple. I'm an apprentice, and I work with the people who actually do the jobs in question, and my responsibilities are to simply try and keep up and give an honest account of what it's like to be these people for one day in their life. Job in question, herding sheep. Great. We go to Craig, and we check into a hotel, and I realize the next day that castration is going to be an absolute part of this work. So normally I never do any research at all, but this is a touchy subject, and I work for the Discovery Channel, and we want to portray accurately whatever it is we do, and we certainly want to do it with a lot of respect for the animals. So I call the Humane Society and I say, look, I'm going to be castrating some lambs. Can you tell me the deal? And they're like, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. They use a band, basically a rubber band like this, a little smaller. This one was actually around the playing cards I got yesterday, but it had a certain familiar.
Philosophers, dramatists, theologians have grappled with this question for centuries. What makes people go wrong? Interestingly, I asked this question when I was a little kid. When I was a kid growing up in the South Bronx, inner city ghetto in New York, I was surrounded by evil, as all kids are who grow up in a city. And I had friends who were really good kids who lived out the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde scenario of Robert Louis Stevenson. That is, they took drugs, got in trouble, went to jail, some got killed, and some did it without drug assistance. So when I read Robert Louis Stevenson, that wasn't fiction. The only question is what was in the juice. And more importantly, that line between good and evil, which privileged people like to think is fixed and impermeable, with them on the good side and the others on the bad side, I knew that line was immovable and it was permeable. Good people could be seduced across that line, and on some rare circumstances, bad kids could recover with help, with reform, with rehabilitation. So I want to begin with this wonderful illusion by Swiss artist M.C. Escher. If you look at it and focus on the white, what you see is a world full of angels. But let's look more deeply. And as we do, what appears is the demons, the devils.
Good morning. Happy to see so many fine folks out here and so many smiling faces. I have a very peculiar background, attitude, and approach to the real world, because I am a conjurer. Now, I prefer that term over magician, because if I were a magician, that would mean that I use spells and incantations and weird gestures in order to accomplish real magic. No, I don't do that. I'm a conjurer who is someone who pretends to be a real magician. Now, how do we go about that sort of thing? We depend on the fact that audiences such as yourselves will make assumptions. For example, when I walked up here and I took the microphone from the stand and switched it on, you assumed this was a microphone, which it is not. As a matter of fact, this is something that about half of you, more than half of you, will not be familiar with. It's a beard trimmer, you see, and makes a very bad microphone. I've tried it many times. The other assumption that you made, and this little lesson is to show you that you will make assumptions, not only that you can, but that you...
We're going to go on a dive to the deep sea, and anyone that's had that lovely opportunity knows that for about 2.5 hours on the way down, it's a perfectly positively pitch black world. And we used to see the most mysterious animals out the window that you couldn't describe, these blinking lights, a world of bioluminescence like fireflies. Dr. Edith Witter, she's now at the Ocean Research and Conservation Association, was able to come up with a camera that could capture some of these incredible animals, and that's what you're seeing here on the screen. That's all bioluminescence, like I said, just like fireflies. There's a flying turkey under turkey. I'm a geologist by training, but I love that. And you see, some of the bioluminescence they use to avoid being eaten, some they use to attract prey, but all of it, from an artistic point of view, is just positively amazing. And a lot of what goes on inside, there's a fish with glowing eyes, pulsating eyes. Some of the colors are designed to hypnotize, these lovely patterns. And then this last one of my favorites, this pinwheel design, just absolutely amazing, every single dive. That's the unknown world, and today we've only explored about 3% of what...
When most people think about the beginnings of AIDS, they're going to think back to the 1980s. And certainly this was the decade in which we discovered AIDS and the virus that causes it, HIV. But in fact, this virus crossed over into humans many decades before, from chimpanzees, where the virus originated, into humans who hunt these apes. This photo was taken before the Great Depression in Brazzaville, Congo. At this time, there were thousands of individuals, we think, that were infected with HIV. So I have a couple of really important questions for you. If this virus was in thousands of individuals at this point, why was it the case that it took us until 1984 to be able to discover this virus? Okay, now more importantly, had we been there in the 40s and 50s, 60s, had we seen this disease, had we understood exactly what was going on with it, how might that have changed and completely transformed the nature of the way that this pandemic moved? In fact, this is not unique to HIV. The vast majority of viruses come from animals, and you can kind of think of this as a pyramid of this bubbling up of viruses from animals into human populations. But only at the very top of this pyramid do these things become completely human. Nevertheless, we spend the vast majority of our energy focused on this level of the pyramid.
I want to talk to you a little bit about user-generated content. I'm going to tell you 3 stories on the way to one argument that's going to tell you a little bit about how we open user-generated content up for business. So here's the first story. 1906, this man, John Philip Sousa, traveled to this place, the United States Capitol, to talk about this technology, what he called the, quote, talking machines. Sousa was not a fan of the talking machines. This is what he had to say. These talking machines are going to ruin artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer evenings, you would find young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. Today, you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left, Sousa said. The vocal cords will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape. Now, this is the picture I want you to focus on. This is a picture of culture. We could describe it, using modern computer terminology, as a kind of read.
So, I guess this is a result of globalization that you can find Coca-Cola tins on top of the Everest and Buddhist monk in Monterey. And so I just came 2 days ago from the Himalayas to your kind invitation, so I would like to invite you also for a while to the Himalayas themselves. And to show the place where meditators like me, who began with being a molecular biologist in Pasteur Institute and found their way to the mountains. So these are a few images I was lucky to take and be there. This is the Mount Kailash in eastern Tibet, wonderful setting. This is from Marlborough country. This is a turquoise lake, a meditator. This is the hottest day of the year, somewhere in eastern Tibet, on August 1st. And the night before, we camped, and my Tibetan friends said, we're going to sleep outside. And I said, why? We have enough space in the tent. They say, yes, but it's summer.